So welcome back to the channel, this tactical intellectual channel. The subject matter for today's presentation is of course Abkhazia. The objective is to provide additional information that I probably didn't go over in the first video presentation on Abkhazia. So in this video presentation, I want to check out two videos and Patrick T. English's article on the Caucuses of the Abkhazian region to further help us to comprehend and understand things and put things in better perspective. So I'll go ahead and start by playing the first video. All right, before I play the video, let me give a slight disclaimer. The content creator who made the video has background music that's kind of loud. It could be distracting depending on what earbuds or headphones you use, but hey, you were warned. But enjoy nonetheless.
Abkhazia. Ever heard of it? No. Let me tell you. It's the land of wine. It's the land of people who live up to 1,000 years old, right? That's all I needed to know. And it's also the land that was full of 300 black people up until, well, recently. You know, the 90s, 2000s, there was a bit of a scuffle, I'll tell you about that. But for now, Afro-Abkhazians.
بجرش تحت زربك قمليت إيهاك جارو ببسنرا صوب شوب زياوي القاب بمقرعك ونفس بشر هاي ببرا همشتشنا واويل القاب دوزانا واويل القاب واويلنا وردر وردورada
No, you did not mishear me. There were indeed Africans living in Abkhazia up until the 20th century and partly even now. Before we get into the story of Afro-Abkhazians, of course, it's quite frankly intriguing and everything, but we obviously have to find out the history of Abkhazia and who even were the regular Abkhazians. Well, it starts off with little known people known as the Aupshwa or Abkhazia. Now, the origins of like anything in the Caucasus is pretty unclear, given the diverse ethnic makeup of the place, right? God given. But as far as we know, it all started off with three kingdoms: Abkhazia, Izakia, and Iberia. Not to be confused with Iberia, aka Spain and Portugal Iberia. This is Caucasus Iberia, different place, different land. The first one, Abkhazia, was also known as the Kingdom of Abkhazia, right? It was the first kingdom, but it was comprised of Kartvelians and Kartvelian speaking people first and foremost. And the Kingdom of Lazikia and Iberia. The first one, the Kingdom of Lazikia, interestingly enough, came after the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire, to be specific. Most important of which is the former, Abkhazia, which will be the one that will later become Abkhazia. Because it, like the other two, are all forms of Georgia. This is why Abkhazia is originally Georgia. This isn't pro-Georgian propaganda, this is just the facts, if anyone out there is wondering. The interesting part is the Abkhazians, right? Because since Abkhazia was always Georgia, who are these Abkhazians? Like Aupsia, Aupshwa, Abkhaz people, as I would call them for simplicity's sakes. Abkhazians, sorry for anything inconvenient. Where did they come from now? Well, they're described by historians as a warlike people who are descended from the ancient Heniochi tribe. So for the next 400 years, this region of Georgia, Abkhazia, would be bounced around between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And at some point around the 18th century, something really unexpected happened. Now, the rest of what I'm going to tell you is as much murky as it is historical, right? Because it's all down to speculation, really. We don't really have that many sources, but we have loads of theories. Now, before I start rambling off, I just want to state the three main theories surrounding the origins of the Afro-Abkhazian people. The first one is the shipwreck theory. There's a number of folk legends that are based on true events, according to one of them, which is mentioned in the memorandum of Ivan Isakov to Nikita Khrushchev. An Ottoman slave ship wrecked near the Abkhazian coast during a storm, with slaves who were brought up for sale. And the current Abkhazians of Afro-Abkhazian descent are the descendants of the survivors of that slave ship. Another legend tells about the Narts, with certain black-faced people from the Horn of Africa. The legendary Narts are said to have come from the Caucuses, a long African campaign, hundreds of African escorts who remained in Abkhazia. And the third theory is the Peter the Great theory, is that Afro-Abkhazians involved with Peter the Great, he imported many black Africans into Russia. And it's said those who were unable to assimilate in the northern capital of Russia, St. Petersburg, were generously given to the Abkhazian princess. Right, so that's the three main ones. Most fantastical popular theory about Afro-Abkhazians were that an Ottoman slave ship crash landed off the coast of Abkhazia, which was part of the Russian Empire, and the people assimilated in local villages, one of them being their most historical one, which is at Zubja, and assimilated with the local population, right? That's not really specific, however. Where did they really come from? For example, our writer, Maxim Gorky, which I assume is true, they do indeed look Ethiopian. But here's the thing. There are two similar theories regarding how, these, if they were Ethiopians, got to, what was then the Russian Empire. First of all, there was the Prince Shevardnadze, who the theory states bought slaves from Ethiopia to work on his plantation. A similar theory about another prince, also from Georgia, Abashidze, who brought slaves from Ethiopia to work on his tea plantation. Now the second one seems a wee bit more realistic, because there is an actual Abash family of Afro-Abkhazians who spoke to journalists in the 1960s/1970s about, their history, the history of their family, the history of Afro-Abkhazians. We can speculate on this for days. It's a pretty murky subject, but what we know for sure is that over time these Afro-Abkhazians eventually assimilated into the local Abkhazian population, adopted the culture, the language, Orthodox Christianity even, and later on in Tsarist times, these Afro-Abkhazians were integrated into the Caucasian cavalry units and fought in all kinds of wars, from the Russo-Turkish War to World War I and even the Russian Civil War. But they weren't just relegated to Abkhazia. They were spread all over the Karabakh in Russia. Right, here's a picture of a Afro-Karabakian in Dagestan, for example, wearing a uniform presumably of a cavalry regiment somewhere. And this Abash family of Afro-Abkhazians really is like the bridge for historians to find out more about this unique culture, right? Like, for example, the most famous member of this Afro-Abkhazian family is Shaban Abash, who served in a Cossack cavalry unit during World War I. Here he is in his cavalry uniform. Joined the Reds in the Russian Civil War, and then became a deputy of the Communist Party of the Abkhaz SSR, when that was a thing, a devout communist and that. Before the 20th century, they also all only spoke Abkhazian, but then, as of the Soviet Russification, standardization of society, they had to learn Russian on top of that also, and started participating in the Soviet way of life. Being in collective farms, growing crops such as citrusites and grapes and wine and all of that good stuff, right? They worked in factories, and like I said, spoke Russian, right? Just living the same life basically as any other Soviet citizen. And then his family would later go on to tell his and story, most importantly the story of their people in the 1970s. And the rest is history, right? Wrong. There's still one more thing. We've reached the 90s, and as is characteristic for Russia during those times, and let's be honest, every other time in history, they inevitably, some faces that were interested in it from there, started a conflict between the Abkhazia people and the Georgians, which is still going on to this day, in fact. Right, now we're not going to delve into who started this conflict. It really deserves its own video, right? Specifically talking about Russian imperialism. That would be a great topic to discuss in the future, right? But we're not going to talk about it now, because frankly, it's a job for another video. But what happened. War between the Georgians and the Abkhazians started. Unfortunately devastated a lot of Afro-Abkhazian former communities and villages, including the village of Atzubsha, right, which was devastating during that war and also during the 2008 Russo-Georgian War. And since it's the historical place that Afro-Abkhazians come from, you know, their populations shrunk quite moderately after that point. It's a pretty sad note in both Georgian and Abkhazian history. And if we're talking about the modern day, modern world now, they're out and about somewhere, but their population is greatly diluted with local Abkhazians, right? Now, a lot of the community in the Caucasus now, they don't really take this whole thing seriously. They've heard about them, they're like, yeah, sure, there were some Afro-Abkhazians, quote-unquote, on this territory, but they all moved away some long time ago, right? Some people even say, the Georgian news publication even said that it was a myth, you know, created by the Soviet Union to spread lies about the great and diverse nature of Soviet society. But
okay, so this guy made some statements in his video that needs to be cleared up, and it's concerning the population numbers and the dates of arrival that these melanated Abkhazians or Georgians or Colchians came into the region. So first of all, it's not the 18th and 17th centuries. You have to go back further than that. You have mythology and you have Herodotus, along with other notable figures throughout history who wrote about the melanated population of these Georgians and Colchians. So to sum it up, you basically have to go back to the Greek days instead of the Roman days, and you have to go back to the 5th century BC instead of the 17th or 18th century. Oh, and did I mention that the numbers were higher than 300? Now, to his credit, he did say and state that the history surrounding the Caucasus region, the Abkhazian region, is indeed murky, which is suspicious or mysterious or gloomy or is cloudy. People don't know for sure. Then he proceeds to go into the conjecture-filled or conjecture-laden explanations surrounding these people and how did they get there. And then he proceeded to use the tried and true slave or servant narrative. I think there was one explanation that it was just some shipwrecked people and then they just got lost in, but that was like 1 out of 4. The rest of them were, hey, these slaves here, servants here, slaves here, shipwrecked slaves bought over from Ethiopia. It's a lot of nonsense if you ask me, but let's clear the confusion up and let's go into English's article on these melanated Colchians or melanated Georgians. So this article is entitled Kushites, Colchians, and Khazars by Patrick T. English. I'm only going to go over the highlighted portion, but if need be, I can always call an audible and read something that's not highlighted, if it's relevant, that is. Let's go ahead and jump into it. Hey, let's start off with a tone setter. The beginning of the article reads, when Herodotus visited Caucuses in the 5th century BC, he found its people to be, as he described them, black-skinned and woolly-haired, that is, seemingly of Negro type. So now I am about to scroll down, zoom in, and start reading. It says, Howe and Wells tried to discredit Herodotus' statement by suggesting that he only called the Caucusians black because he thought of them as Egyptians, and that his idea of Egyptian appearance were confused by the many Negro slaves seen by him in Memphis. Herodotus, however, records nothing as to his having seen a single Negro slave in Egypt, whereas he was constantly in conversation with priests who presumably were typical Egyptians of Mediterranean race. Alright, so let's reset. You see that this is the same article. Let's scroll down, zoom in, and proceed to read. It says, near Sukhumi in Abkhazia, in almost the same district where Herodotus talked to the black-skinned and woolly-haired Caucusians some 22 centuries ago, John Gunther noted the existence of a small Negro community. He was told that its members were descended from slaves imported from Africa many centuries ago by Georgian princes. The same community was noted by Corliss Lamont. He was told that its members were descended from slaves imported from Africa more than a century ago by Turkish landowners. And in this connection, he mentions Sukhumi's active slave trade in former times. J. Malt Brune, however, mentions Sukhum's slave trade as an export one in local inhabitants, especially Circassian girls, for shipment to Constantinople. He describes Abkhazia as a lawless land of continual slave raiding by local chiefs. Even if Georgian princes or Turkish landowners were ever settled in Abkhazia, it seems unlikely that they would go to the trouble and expense of bringing coals to Newcastle by importing slaves from Africa in sufficient numbers to form an enduring community. The explanations given for the origin of this community might well be on par with the explanation formerly given for the Andaman Islands Negritos, that they were descended from the cargo of an African slave ship that had once been wrecked there. You know, that was a very good point that English made in this article right there. The Andaman Island Negritos, the first Indians, and they're still alive. They had to go through that crazy narrative, the slave narrative. This is one thing that Western academia have a crazy habit of doing. I mean, when I say Western, I'm talking about the Stankian, the Palito variety. They have a crazy, insatiable urge, and they just carry it out. It's habitual with them. That slave, that servant narrative, it always happens when it comes to the original peoples, the melanated peoples of the earth. They just hate that history. It's hated history, so they're rather, I guess it disgusts them to no end, so they just want to do away with it altogether. All right, so let's go to the other side, the right side here, and start off. It says, there might be a possible connection with the Bantu ethnic prefix Aba or Ba, the plural prefix for the grammatical class of human beings. We do not know that the people whom the Greeks called Kolchoi call themselves by that name. It is conceivable that they called themselves Abkhaz, and that the modern country of Abkhaz, in that case, took its name from them. If so, the syllable Kaz is the root or real name of the Abkhazian people and country, as with Baganda and Buganda in Africa. The use of quasi-Bantu grammatical classes is a feature of some East Caucasus languages. So let's drop down a little bit, and it says, the identity of name though suggests a connection between the two countries, while on the other side, Kash has a resemblance to Kaz that suggests a connection between the Hittite king's enemies, the modern Abkhaz, and hypothetically Herodotus' Caucuses. Between Ethiopia, Kash, northeast of Katai, and Ethiopia, Kash, south of Egypt, the Greeks located the legend of Andromeda at Joppa. She was described as the daughter of Cephas or Cepheus and Cassiopeia, king and queen of the Ethiopians in Palestine. Hey, remember folks, knowledge is power because it gives you the boldness to actually look into things and give strong rebuttals when that narrative is kind of weak, but a lot of people accept the narrative. You get that boldness to be the only one or one of the few to stand up against it. You see, the Greeks were writing mythology about these people, these melanated people in their area long time ago. But in our modern day, we just want to ignore it and pretend like we don't have a clue what's going on. It's just mysterious stuff. All right, so let's go ahead and check out page 51, the highlighted portion. And it reads, another Ethiopian in Greek legend, the jet black prince Memnon, is described as handsomest of the men who fought at Troy. The modern Nilotes, such as the Shilluk and Dinka. He came to the aid of the Trojans with his Ethiopian army, not from the south, the direction of far off Ethiopia on the Nile, but from the east, where Pontic Cash lay less than 600 miles away, only a fraction of his traditional route from Nubia via Elam, Babylon, and Armenia. His mother was either the dawn goddess, emphasizing his eastern origin, or Gissia, which could well be a form of the name Cash. His father was Tithonus, whose name, it has been suggested, is probably a form of the name Dedon of the great god of Cush on the Nile. He could have been the god of Cush on the Halis. Also, Dedon is almost identical with Dodona and the Egyptian women or black doves who founded the Dodona oracle may have come not from Egypt but from Memnon's Cash, and so may have been actually black. I really do appreciate the level of detail that he goes into when he breaks down the nuance, the gray area of this subject, the Pontic Cash and the Ethiopic angle or links when it comes to the mythological component that the Greeks told of their dealings or colonial presence within the Caucasus region. Alright, so we're done with page 51. Let's move on to page 52 and read the highlighted portion. It says, across the Caucasus from Colchis and Abkhazia, the Khazar people ruled a wide empire between the 6th and 11th centuries AD. The Arab geographer Takri, describing them, remarks that a section of the Khazars were brown or even black of skin, as if they were a kind of Indians. The nearest regions of India, however, are as far from Khazaria as from Lydia and are inhabited by comparatively paler or fairer skinned people, whereas Herodotus' black Colchians were, and the Abkhazian Negroes are just across the mountains that were the southern defense of Khazaria's border. It is much easier to imagine that these black Khazars had moved over the Caucasus passes rather than from India on a 2,000-mile route over mountains and deserts and through organized kingdoms. The very name of the Khazars might well be derived from Kaz and ultimately from Kash. The Khazars had a double kingship, a secluded sacred ruler under the Turkish title of Kakwan, and a secular ruler and war leader under the Turkish title of Beg. The Abkhazia had two kings. One was said to rule the east and one the west, but they were mentioned, or they are mentioned, as a pair rather than as two independent sovereigns. The institution of a secluded sacred king seems more African than Asian. Besides early Egypt, where the god was contrasted with the man, there are instances in West Africa at Shark Point, Fernando Po, Benin, Luango, Onitsha, and elsewhere. That's very, very interesting right there. This is pretty much part of the course for my platform. I like to leave a cliffhanger and leave you guys hanging on certain subjects. Now, in regards to the Khazarian subject matter, I'm not even going to talk about that yet. This presentation is about the Kushites and Colchians. The Khazarian aspect will come later on, but in the meantime, let's go ahead and move on to the next page. Alright, so let's drop down to page 53, and it reads, long after Herodotus' time, the inhabitants of Caucuses seems to have been still of the same physical type as he found there. P.H. Larcher states that St. Jerome and Sophronius, cited by Bochart, called Caucuses the second Ethiopia, and Sophronius, in his Life of St. Andrew, informs us that towards the mouth of the Apsarus and on the banks of the Faces there were Ethiopians. Since St. Jerome wrote circa the end of the 4th century AD, and Sophronius, Patriarch of Jerusalem, over 2 centuries later, it seems that this Negro nation in the Caucasus region remained in being for at least 1,000 years after Herodotus and some 3 centuries after Sophronius. Its Takri was writing of black Khazars north of the Caucasus and on the Volga. It may have been in Sophronius' lifetime that the black Abkhazo-Colchians were overwhelmed, for it was about then that the Khazar nation and empire founded, it may be surmised, by Colchian refugees began its career. You know, I really enjoyed this article right here. Patrick T. English was not playing around when he constructed this entire piece right here. A lot of depth of facts in here, man. And I'll definitely leave the link to this article in the description so you guys can have easy access to this. And whenever this subject encounters you, you know how to rebuff it or rebuttal everything. Because I mean, it's a lot of narrative surrounding, just like the guy says, it's murky, it's not clear, but this helps clear things up. So let's go ahead and play a video clip.
To be. So here we go. The first diaspora, the mystery of the Afro-Abkhazians. So for those of you who don't know, Abkhazia is an unrecognized, but they self-proclaim themselves as a state entity. Many countries still consider it part of Georgia, but Russia considers it as its own separate country. Complicated, but we're not here to discuss that. We're here to discuss about a certain people group that you can find there. Today, there is a small community of people that are descended from Africans that live in this small little area in the Caucasus region of Western Asia. It's so weird calling the Caucasus region Western Asia because it's like its own thing, but it's technically Asia. It's whatever, you get the point. Anyway, historically, it was documented that there were at least a few villages that were predominantly inhabited by Afro-Abkhazians. And it's more confusing because people don't exactly even quite know where they came from. There are two main prevailing theories. One from the Russian Academy of Sciences, Ethnology and Anthropology Institute. They claim that these Africans were brought in from an Ottoman slave ship. During the Ottoman Empire times, they typically interacted with the east coast of Africa and the Indian Ocean with the Arab slave trade. And they claim it was most likely from a ship that was wrecked off the coast of Abkhazia, carrying enslaved people that most likely came from Sudan or Somalia. The enslaved people were allowed to settle there, and then inevitably they intermixed with the Abkhazian community. They took on Abkhazian names and they learned the language, and that's basically how they started living there. However, there's another claim that goes back to antiquity to about the 5th century BC. The ancient historian Herodotus wrote about the Caucuses, which were people that inhabited the area of what is now Abkhazia, and he claims that they had coarse hair and darker complexion skin. He said they came from northern Africa. Who knows, but the Russian Institute claim is the one that's more widely accepted. So yeah, the estimated number for the population is hard to come by because over the years they just intermixed so much with the Abkhazian people, and today people aren't completely sure. The earliest sources say that the community was from a few families to a few villages. What we do know is that during the Georgia-Abkhazia War in 1992 and 1993, I believe. Let me check my notes. Yes, 92, 93. 3 villages were destroyed that were known for having the Afro-Abkhaz population: Zyuzhba, Kindig, and Tamsh. So unfortunately, there were casualties of that war. However, some of the descendants still live on today, but it's hard to come by because, after generations of intermixing with the Abkhazian people, it's hard to tell exactly who genetically is descended from this Afro-Abkhazian community. Some of the descendants might have coarse hair or a little bit of a darker complexion on their skin tone, but for what it's worth, they've been documented to exist there, and they have been documented to have integrated into the Abkhazian community.
So that was a very good video, very interesting, but let's go ahead and examine this book that you see to the right, Russia and the Negro by Alison Blakely. It's talking about blacks in Russian history and thought. So this is chapter 6 right here, and check out what it says. It says, in Soviet society, as in Tsarist Russia, the largest native Russian Negro population are the Negroes who have for centuries resided in the Black Sea area. In Soviet Russia, they have become dispersed over a broader area of the Soviet Union and have become more completely assimilated into the general population. However, due to the conflicting nature of the available relevant information, the situation of this 20th century black population is almost as much a mystery as is the origin of its ancestors. So now we're on page 78. Let me scroll down for a little bit. I will underline instead of read, but the main gist is state-sponsored relocations, forced relocations of these melanated Abkhazian citizens, and that did drop the numbers significantly because you're taking these people here and dispersing them all over Russia instead of having them concentrated in these 3 cities, these historically melanated Abkhazian cities. They were scattered against their will, really. Now, I know initially that could seem far-fetched and hard to believe, but Russian precedent of forced removal has been set already, and we have the examples of the Chechens, the Kabardians, and the Balkars. That's proof positive that such an occurrence has indeed happened before in Russia. So let's go ahead and scroll down and substantiate the claim here. Now, it's saying that there's evidence that supported that line of reasoning, and the year is 1931, and it says that the anthropologist Adler, he observed that there were small colonies of Negroes in Abkhazia, and as you can see here, they did not intermarry with non-melanated people of that region, despite governmental encouragement to do so. So we have the account of Otto Hall, who went to the Soviet Union for training in 1925. He learned from a white Abkhazian woman in Moscow, Russia, that there were native Negroes in the Abkhazian region, the city or area of Sukhumi. So naturally, he traveled there and he spent several weeks amongst the community of 800 melanated native Abkhazian peoples. Hall did note that there was some evidence of intermarriage between the melanated and the Palido populations, but he stated that there were some villagers who seemed 100% melanated or African. So let's scroll down a little bit and see what the, Russian government or officials did to remedy this issue of, you can say, non-assimilation. I like how they worded this. It says, if the Soviet government determined that total assimilation of the Negroes into the general population was desirable, the effect might have been developed more expeditiously by encouraging and helping the Negroes to relocate individually or in small groups to other areas throughout the Soviet Union. So basically, the author of this book, Blakely, he admits that this is in the realm of conjecture and is pretty much based off of patterns that were noticed from over the years regarding the population in Abkhazia. But let's drop down a little bit and just go over this little experience here. Now, the setup was, okay, you had a tour group from America. Some melanated folks came over to Moscow and they're in a train station, right? The year is December 1975, and it says that the American tour group encountered a sizable group of other melanated people in Moscow, the train station, late one evening. And when they looked at them, they first took them to be African. But it says when the person from the American tour group inquired about their origins, he was told that they were from Georgia, the country, not the state. We know there's a lot of melanated people in the state of Georgia, but we're talking about the country of Georgia in the Caucasus region. So I found that fairly interesting because in the West, in the US to be exact, you're taught and programmed to disassociate seeing melanated people in that part of the world. It's not showed or spoken of in the media. You don't see it in movies. You don't read about it in books, maybe National Geographic. But outside of that, you don't learn about it in history. And when you do speak about it, then you're denigrated and disparaged. Isn't that something? You end up knowing after school, after college or university, that these people have a very rich history in the region, that part of the world. There's 3 cities that are historically melanated, and then you're going all the way back to Herodotus' time. He's speaking about that, but then in our present day, they don't want you to take any note or lend any credence to what the ancient folks back then said regarding the melanated presence of that region. Now, my final thoughts on Abkhazia goes as follows. When it comes to the origins of these people, instead of sitting at the table of murky, shadowy, unsure history regarding their origins, why don't we just properly assess the stories around these swarthy, melanated Abkhazian Georgian people, instead of indulging in, slave narrative, servant narrative, whatever else that could be demeaning towards these people? Why don't we just look at the gray area and not partake of the black and the white, pun intended, of these people? Some may have been slaves, some weren't, because the melanated presence goes back to the 5th century CE. More than likely, it was before that time. Now, my final thought is that there was a mix of soft power and later on hard power used in this, situation regarding the melanated Abkhazians. Now, in this instance, the promotion of assimilation was the tactic of soft power right there. They didn't have to force them to do that initially. Now, later on, we do have stories where there were forced relocations. Now, that's hard power right there. You have to act with force and aggression to get your goal completed instead of using persuasion. Now, that Abkhazia, Georgia conflict or war back in the early 90s, that's interesting because sometimes if you want to target something, you have to make it seem completely random. To me, the end result speaks for itself. You had 3 villages that were hit. The population of those villages dropped, and you have to remember those 3 cities were historically melanated population centers. And were they targeted? I'm really not sure, but I do see the aftermath and the effects decades later. So that's up for you to decide. So I think I'm going to end the video presentation here. Thanks for lending an ear and eyes to see this thing, and catch you guys later.